Eve had everything: beauty, peace, belonging. Yet one quiet question began to press on her heart. Then the serpent's presence drew near like a whisper with a smile, inviting her to doubt what she already knew. Because if she reached for what God had forbidden, everything could fracture: trust, safety, and the peace they lived in. But this moment would not end in simple regret. God would meet their brokenness, slowly, painfully, faithfully. This is the story of Adam and Eve, how one choice opened the wound of humanity, and why God began a rescue plan. Adam had never known fear or doubt. Every breath felt safe, every moment wrapped in God's quiet care. Eve had been given to him as a gift, and in her eyes he saw joy reflected back without fear. The world felt endless then, overflowing with beauty they never had to earn or protect. Yet somewhere deep inside Eve, a small, restless question began to grow. What if there was something more than this perfect life? Something God had kept just out of reach. The tree did not look dangerous. It looked beautiful, rich with promise and glowing with possibility. And in that stillness, something else was watching her, waiting for the moment to speak. Its voice slid into her thoughts, gentle and clever, like a question pretending to be kindness. It made her wonder if God had truly told her everything, or if something precious was being hidden. And with that small doubt, the first crack in human trust quietly began to open. A quiet unease stirred inside Eve, as if the peace she once knew was slowly slipping through her fingers. The serpent did not shout or threaten. It simply suggested that God might not be as generous as she believed. She began to wonder if obedience was costing her something, if staying faithful meant staying smaller than she could be. Adam sensed something was changing, though he could not yet name it, as if a quiet storm was gathering between them. And in that moment, her heart leaned toward the fruit, even as the last whisper of trust quietly tried to hold her back. Everything inside her trembled, as if the whole of humanity were waiting to see which way her heart would lean. The moment her fingers brushed the fruit, something sacred quietly shifted in the space between her and God. For the first time, she felt the strange weight of knowing something God had never wanted her to carry. When Adam looked into her eyes, he saw not joy, but a quiet fear that something had already been lost. And with love pulling him one way and faith pulling him another, Adam stood at the edge of the same terrible choice. In that quiet moment, Adam chose Eve over God, not with anger, but with a heart that did not want to be alone. He crossed the same invisible line, and with that single choice, the world they knew quietly slipped away. In an instant, they felt it. The gentle innocence they once wore had fallen away, leaving them exposed and afraid. For the first time, Eve saw herself not as loved and safe, but as something fragile that needed to be hidden. And so they hid, not from the garden, but from the terrible new feeling that something inside them had gone terribly wrong. The garden that once felt like home suddenly grew quiet, as if even the trees were waiting for God to speak. They pressed themselves into the shadows, hoping somehow that God would not notice the fear beating in their hearts. Then God's voice moved through the garden, not with thunder, but with a tender call meant for his children. In that gentle calling, Eve felt her heart break, because she knew she could no longer run from what she had done. Adam felt the same weight pressing on his chest, as if the truth he tried to hide was now standing before him. Standing there in the open, they felt smaller than they ever had, as if their hearts were suddenly laid bare. Eve felt the weight of her choice pressing against her soul, heavy with sorrow and longing for what had been lost. Adam felt it too, knowing that love had not saved him from the consequences of turning away from God. For the first time, even the bond between them felt fragile, stretched thin by the truth they could no longer escape. And in the silence that followed, the full weight of what they had done finally began to settle over their hearts. They waited for anger, for rejection, for everything they feared God might become after their terrible mistake. Instead, God prepared coverings for them, a quiet act of care that spoke of love even in the middle of loss. Even in her shame, Eve felt that God had not turned away from her, but was still gently reaching out. Adam realized that though the garden was changing, God's heart toward them had not grown cold or cruel. Though they would leave Eden, they would not leave God's care, for his love would follow them into the unknown. Eve felt the ache of goodbye pressing against her heart, as the beauty she once knew slowly slipped out of her reach. Adam knew that though the future was uncertain, they would now have to walk it together, outside the garden they once called home. Even as they stepped away from Eden, a quiet promise was already unfolding, one that would someday heal what had been broken. They did not know how or when, but God had already begun a story of redemption that would outlast their mistake. From this broken beginning, God would one day bring a Savior who would restore what their hearts had lost. Though her innocence was gone, Eve still carried the promise that life would one day rise from what had fallen. Adam understood now that love would need to grow deeper than fear if their story was going to survive the pain. Even outside Eden, God was still writing a story where broken people could be gently guided back toward his heart. One day, God himself would step into this wounded world, carrying the love that would heal every scar. And though their fall changed everything, God's love would change even more, guiding humanity back toward the life it lost. The world outside Eden felt wider and colder, and for the first time, Adam and Eve realized how alone they truly were. Every step carried the weight of what she had lost, as if the memory of Eden was now a quiet ache inside her chest. Adam felt the same burden, knowing that love had not protected them from the cost of turning away from God. Though they walked side by side, a quiet distance had begun to grow, born from the shame neither of them yet understood. For the first time, Eve began to feel the strange ache of self-awareness, the feeling that something inside her was no longer whole. The choice they made did not stay behind in Eden. It followed them into every step they took beyond the garden. The loneliness that crept into Eve's heart was the same loneliness every human would one day feel when love begins to fracture. Adam felt the weight of being a man who could not undo what he had chosen, a burden every generation would carry. Even the love they once shared so easily now had to fight against fear, shame, and the ache of broken trust. And in that silent distance between them, the first shape of human heartbreak quietly began to form. Though they felt far from God, his presence still quietly walked with them through every uncertain step they took. Even in her confusion, Eve sensed that the God who had made her had not stopped watching over her life. Adam began to understand that even failure could not erase the responsibility God had placed inside his heart. Slowly, even in the brokenness, they began to find their way back toward one another, learning how to walk in grace. Though her world had changed forever, Eve's heart was still being gently shaped by the God who refused to abandon her. From that moment on, every human story would carry the echo of their first broken choice. Their sorrow would become our sorrow, their longing our longing, passed down quietly through every generation. Yet through all those long years, God never stopped guiding humanity back toward the love it had lost. Even as the world changed around her, Eve carried the quiet hope that God's promise would one day come true. And far beyond their lifetime, God was already preparing the love that would one day restore everything they had broken. Through every century that followed, humanity would keep walking toward a hope it could barely name. And in God's perfect time, that hope would step into the world as living, breathing love. The one who would undo the fall was already part of God's plan, long before Adam and Eve ever knew his name. Though they could not see him yet, God's promise was already reaching through time toward their broken hearts. And somewhere deep inside Eve, a fragile peace began to grow, as if God was gently stitching her broken heart together. Eve was no longer only the woman who had fallen, but the woman God still saw with tender and faithful love. Adam too began to understand that his failure did not cancel the purpose God had written into his life. Though the world was still broken, God was quietly rebuilding something beautiful inside their hearts. From the very first mistake, God had already begun shaping a future where love would be stronger than sin. And for the first time since Eden, Eve felt something new rising inside her, a quiet hope that her story was not over. Across every generation, people would carry the same quiet ache, searching for the God their hearts remembered. And through all those years, God never stopped reaching toward his children, even when they no longer knew his name. The one who would heal the broken world was already waiting, long before anyone knew how deeply they needed him. Somehow, even without understanding it, Eve could feel that God had not finished writing her story. And even after everything that was lost, God was still walking with them toward a future filled with grace. Eve could feel the past still resting on her heart, but it no longer held the same power over her soul. Adam understood that though Eden was gone, the God who made them was still patiently shaping their lives. Together they began to see that even broken beginnings could lead to something quietly beautiful in God's hands. From their first failure, God had already been weaving a story of love that nothing, not even sin, could undo. And in her quiet heart, Eve finally believed that her life was still held inside God's faithful and unchanging love. Though Eden was gone, God's presence had not left them, and that truth slowly began to settle in their hearts. God had not abandoned his creation. He was still gently guiding it toward a love that would never fail. For the first time since the fall, Eve felt that her future was no longer ruled by fear, but by hope. And together they began to walk forward, not as perfect people, but as loved people held by God's mercy. From the first broken step to the long road ahead, God would walk with humanity, always guiding it back toward love. Thank you for staying with us through the story of Adam and Eve, a story about love, loss, and God's faithful mercy. If this story touched your heart or helped you see God's love in a new way, we invite you to like and subscribe. Here on Living Word Afrotales, we share biblically faithful stories told with emotion, history, and heart. If someone you love needs this reminder, please share this story. And remember that you are seen and deeply loved by God. Until next time, may God's peace stay with you, and may His love continue to guide your heart wherever you go.